Hello and welcome to the Ride Around the Murray Festival. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Wiradjuri people as the traditional custodians of this land and pay respect to Wiradjuri elders past and present. And I would like to extend that respect to all First Nations people. My name is Anne-Marie, I'm the Festival Director. Welcome to our second and final author conversation for this evening. This session begins with a short Yarnbomb, a poem by local Wiradjuri educator Ruth Davys, followed by our panel. Now, before I introduce Ruth, I will introduce our panel moderator, Irma Gold, who will follow on directly from Ruth and her Yarnbomb, and then Irma will introduce her conversation guests and this evening's panel. Irma is based in Naarm, Melbourne. She's the co-host of the writing podcast Secrets from the Green Room and is an author and editor of short stories and books for adults and children, and has authored 5 children's picture books, a short story collection, 2 Steps Forward, and her debut novel, The Breaking, which won the Canberra Critics Circle Award and was shortlisted for the ACT Notable Award for Fiction. So Irma will, will introduce her panel shortly, following Ruth's performance.
Thank you to Ruth for yarn-bombing us. That was fantastic. And I would like to also acknowledge the Wiradjuri people as the original storytellers of this land that we're meeting on to talk about story. And given our topic today, Mum's the Word, in particular, I would like to acknowledge First Nations mothers everywhere, especially those who had their children stolen from them, and acknowledge the generational trauma that has come from that. So I think it's appropriate to honour those women here today at this panel. Now, we have 3 incredible writers who are going to talk to us about the mothers who play pivotal roles in their books. So let me introduce them to you. I have sitting next to me Gina Perry, who is an award-winning writer and science historian. She's the author of the acclaimed Behind the Shock Machine and The Lost Boys, both of which went behind the scenes on 2 of social psychology's most famous experiments. Her debut novel, My Father the Whale, was shortlisted for the HarperCollins Banjo Prize and explores the powerful pull of the absent mother. Next to her we have Paul Dalgarno, who is a Scottish-Australian author and journalist who immigrated to Australia in 2010. He's published 2 novels, a memoir and a work of creative non-fiction. His latest novel, A Country of Eternal Light, is about motherhood, love and loss, and is dedicated to his late mum, June. And then on the end there we have Rijn Collins, who is a Melbourne writer with a background in linguistics, a future in Iceland, and a passion for stories of the odd and obsessive. Having decided at a young age not to have children, becoming a stepmother in recent years has proven both an illuminating and deeply rewarding experience. Now, just to let you know, we will have time for questions at the end, so please store those up. But before we get on to the books, I would like to start by asking all of you to name your favourite mother in literature, but you can't name your own book. Gina, do you want to kick us off?
Well, mine's a fairly recent read, and the woman is Edna Kinsella, and she is the mother who takes in the child in Claire Keegan's book, Foster. And she's not the child's mother, but she is a wonderful mother to that child.
Great. Paul?
I've actually forgotten the name of the mum, but it's in the book, The House of the Spirits by Isabella Allende. There's a mum in there. And there's lots of stuff about clairvoyancy and stuff, and she's a kind of pivotal central figure in a family. I've forgotten her name. I wasn't expecting the questions.
Right.
Mine is actually non-fiction, if that's okay. It was a book that...
I'll allow it.
I did look through all my bookcases. It was a book that meant a lot to me as a teen, and it's called I Don't Want to Live This Life. It's by Deborah Spungen, who was the mother of Nancy Spungen of Sid and Nancy kind of punk fame, and her daughter was castigated throughout the press, and it was a mother's very tender retelling of her daughter's upbringing, and a really personal portrayal of someone that to this day is treated incredibly badly in any account of the punk movement in the 70s. And it was a really inside look, basically. And it's one of those books where I had 3 copies, one so I could lend it, one so I could have it in my bookstore, and one in my bookshelf, and one that I could keep under the bed in case the other 2 disappeared. And I almost wanted to bring it today to hold it up, and I thought, what if I forget it? And I leave it in Albury. So no, it's
That is a sign of a good book, where you have to have multiple copies, so you always have one.
Yes.
It's nothing worse than lending it out and it disappearing forever. Okay, so that's 3 great recommendations for you, and we've got 3 more. So I'm going to take you through a little summary on each of their books so that we can then get stuck into it. So in Gina Perry's My Father the Whale, 9-year-old Ruby lives an itinerant life with her father Mitch, busking for a living. Her mother died when she was just a baby, and it's the only life that she's known until they become stranded in a small coastal town where Ruby begins to see that life could be different for her. Then in Paul Dalgarno's A Country of Eternal Light, our narrator, Margaret Bryce, is dead. And from the afterlife, she's revisiting parts of the life that she lived with her husband Henry and her twin daughters, Rachel and Eva, jumping back and forth in time. She doesn't know why this is happening, but as the novel progresses, we begin to realise the purpose behind it all. And in Rijn Collins' Fed to Red Birds, Elva has left Melbourne and moved to Reykjavik, Iceland, in search of the mother who left her as a child. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. That was probably a very poor pronunciation of Reykjavik.
sounds good to me.
Oh, great. So Elva finds work in a cabinet of curiosities and tries to hide her obsession with her Icelandic grandfather's famous book. Now, interestingly, all 3 of these mothers in these books are absent in some way. And the other thing that makes these books tricky is that all 3 of them have major twists, which we cannot discuss here, which is so hard because they're such good twists. And if you haven't read these books, it's one of the things that makes them an excellent book club book, because you get to talk with everyone else about those twists and unpack them. So I'd really recommend all 3 of them for that. So because we can't spoil the books for people, what I wanted to start by asking you about was the twist in a more general way. So I'm really interested to know whether you knew what the twist was involving your mother from the outset, or whether it emerged during the writing process. Rijn, do you want to start?
I knew from the beginning. I actually knew the twist in the end before I really knew what was in the middle. I knew where I wanted to land her and leave her, but I didn't know when I started how to get her there, and that was a real journey for me. So for me, it was an integral part of the whole book. It was in the notes at the beginning, but the development took time and was a bit of a revelation when, as writing is, like, oh, I didn't know that was going to happen. But I did know about the mum, from the start.
Interesting. Paul, what about you?
So I knew there was going to be a twist, but I didn't know it was going to be the twist that currently happens. And it was really, and so I was writing it all the way through thinking something else was going to happen. And it was... When
you say something else, you had an idea of what you thought might happen.
Yeah. And so there are smoking guns for that twist in the book, but the twist just doesn't happen. And then I was having a shower one day and realised what the actual twist should be, but didn't know if I'd be able to write it convincingly for me, first of all. But I wrote it, and then from that point went back and put in new smoking guns all the way through. So, yeah.
In doing my research, I read, or maybe I heard, that you cried when you wrote the scene that's pivotal in that twist.
Yeah, it wasn't actually that scene. Yeah, I've taught it. I'm a bad crier. I'm an aspirational crier. I'd like to cry.
I like that, aspirational crier.
Recently, I've actually started getting a bit better. Even at some films and things. But traditionally, I've really struggled to cry. But it wasn't actually that scene. Funnily enough. It was a different scene a couple of chapters later in the book that made me cry. Yeah.
All right. So you're not crying over the twist. Okay. Well, that's disappointing.
Yeah.
Gina, what about you? Did you know the twist from the outset?
I knew that the 2 characters were alone and that they comprised each other's world, and I knew that Ruby's mother had died, but no, the actual story emerged in the writing for me. I had to write my way to understanding what had happened and why Ruby's father kept that secret from her.
So how far during the writing process did you discover that?
I tried several scenarios about the mother before I got to the final one, but when I got to it, it made sense and it felt right, but it took a lot of work to get there.
Did you have to go back and revise anything, the way Paul was talking about going back and looking to see if it all made sense?
Yes, because whatever happened to the mother had to be hinted at early on in different ways. So, yeah, I did have to do that.
Interesting. All right, well, you'll have to read them all to find out what the twist is. But following on from that, I'd like to know how you developed your mother characters. So were they based on people that you knew? How did they arrive on the page for you? Gina, can you start us?
Very, very loosely, I have known a couple of people who've given birth and died very soon afterwards, and so that for me was a pretty powerful experience. And then imagining what life would be for a child being raised by a father who was pretty hedonistic and expected that life would go on pretty much as he liked it to be, I think that was really that's where it took off for me. But yeah, I did have that experience of people that I knew, and that was really what spurred me on in terms of Ruby's story. Yeah.
So the character was more a kind of composite of people.
It was
you
more
knew?
the experience
Right.
of actually a woman dying soon after the birth of a child that really got me going. But it wasn't, Ruby's mother in the book isn't based on anyone I know specifically. It's more that situation of how you deal with that, raising a child.
Yeah. Paul, in your book, I mean, all three of these mothers are absent in different ways, but yours is the most presence in a sense. I mean, she's in the afterlife and observing, going backwards and forwards in time, but we're with her the whole time. Was she based on women who you knew?
Yeah, a couple of people. So, my mum, as you said in your intro, died in 2014, as Margaret did. So some of the specifics around dates and things is tied to my own mum. But personality-wise, it's actually my dad's mum that Margaret takes most from. So she was just like a real character of a woman. She used to, she lived into her 80s, and she had her children young. My parents had me young, so all my grandparents were alive into, my last granddad only died last year, and I'm, in my late 40s. She was in my life the whole way through, all my grandparents were. And she used to say really funny things about other old people and how they behaved and stuff, which I loved. She raised triplets. She was the first woman to successfully give birth to triplets in Aberdeen, who all became mini celebrities in Aberdeen, the Dalgarno triplets. There's news stories about them. There was one last year about their 70th birthday. So Margaret's a mother of twins. In my book, originally there were triplets, but one of the girls wasn't doing enough work, so it became twins. I had to get rid of one of the characters. But yeah, she was a working class woman, like all of my family, very working class, but a real autodidact. She was really engaged with things and eclectic with her reading. She'd read kind of, I guess, what are called pot boilers, but she'd also read people like Salman Rushdie or poetry and all the rest of it. And so yeah, she's a real no-nonsense, down-to-earth, sweet and very humorous and quite cutting woman. So she's, in a way, the main... I don't think she'd look at Margaret in the book and think, oh, that's me, but for me, she's the main inspiration for that character.
I read one review, and this book has been getting rave reviews, but the only criticism that I read, I thought was interesting because I read an article on your blog talking about, so the review said, oh, well, she's a working class woman, and yet, she's an intellectual. She has intellectual ideas, she uses, large words. And this reviewer thought that didn't add up with a working class background. But I read about how, your whole family, they were all intellectuals from this working class background, didn't necessarily go to university.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think they refer to themselves as intellectuals, but I know exactly what you're saying. But I mean, I think, and Margaret, like literally on page 3 of the book, Margaret attacks this head on, where she says that people equate working class lives with inferior brains. And that happened more in the past, but it still happens now in reviews and elsewhere, where people are kind of astounded or a bit affronted that somebody from a working class background would use a word with 3 syllables, or have an interest in anything beyond going down the mines, or whatever the kind of preconception is. So I was aware of that criticism too, but what I can honestly say is that I've known plenty of working class people in my life, and their brains, I've not seen inside their head, but I imagine their brains look the same, and their capacity is just the same as anybody else, regardless of background.
Yeah. Rijn, what about you? Where did your mother come from?
Sense of place. I think Iceland plays a huge role in my novel and my life. Like, I'm obsessed with Iceland. I don't think I could write about something that I didn't passionately love myself. And I've spent quite a bit of time there, and I had a 1-month writing residency in a tiny little fishing village up near the Arctic Circle. And I didn't meet many Icelanders. They don't... it's an incredible landscape, but there wasn't an active social life. It was also winter, so that kind of explains it. And I just saw them relate to their landscape and their location so much that Elva's mum fell in love with Elva's dad in London and moved out to Melbourne and brought Elva up in the Dandenongs, which is the rainforest about 30 k's east of Melbourne, where I grew up. And I found her through imagining how this kind of introverted, stoic woman dealt with the snakes and the huntsman spiders, and when I was in Iceland, the avalanche sirens would go off, and I didn't know what they were, but they were very reminiscent of the fire. My dad was a fireman, of the fire sirens, and I found a lot of parallels between the land that could just take you away in an instant, but give you such magical, just a sense of really wonder. And I wanted to put her in the Dandenongs and see how she dealt with that, and it turns out not very well. And that's how I found her. So through taking her out of her comfort zone and putting her into a place that's my comfort zone, but raising a child where she didn't really speak the language as well as, it's through having her react to branches and possums on the roof and realising that's how I found her character. But she wasn't based on anyone I knew. They didn't talk to many Icelanders. I would have loved to have, but I wanted that insular notion, but in a very kind of tactile world.
Interestingly, all 3 of your books deal with that mother-daughter relationship rather than the mother-son relationship. Was that something you specifically wanted to explore, Rijn?
It's my first novel, and they say you explore what you know, and I don't have any brothers, and I have had a tense relationship, not now, very close to my parents, but in my teens and 20s, not at all. And I didn't plan to write that into the manuscript, but the distance and the searching became part of Elva's life as it was mine. So never considered from a male perspective. I always knew it was Elva and her mum. Yeah.
So it just happened organically. Yeah. What about you, Paul? Was that something you specifically set out to write about?
I mean, my previous book was all from the point of view of a guy of about my age, so that was very much thinking about how to write a man, and then I was very interested in the kind of female relationships and motherhood. Like I said, my triplet aunties were women, and as a boy, I was very shy, that kind of chronically shy. And so the people I kind of hid behind and watched more were my female relatives, my mum and my gran, my aunts and stuff. So, yeah, I feel really interested in men and women, but for this one, I was just really wanting to remember and think about and do the best job I could of a female relationship, female to female.
Did you ever feel that was challenging, coming from the perspective of a man? It was
heaps. Heaps, yeah. I mean, some of the writing in that book goes back to 2012, and it's just been published this year. And it started out in third person, then it went to first person. It just sounded like a caricature. It sounded like Mrs. Doubtfire. I mean, it's a Scottish woman of a certain age, and I'm a man. And so trying to get that to sound authentic took a really, really long time. And then what I kind of realized was just, I just had to kind of go in myself a little bit and think about just the commonality of human experience and stick to the stuff that's really, really common and don't try to write about anything I couldn't possibly know. So, you know, I mean, obviously, like everyone here, talked to plenty of women in my life, but there are certain areas, I'm not even sure what they are, but I would have known them if I'd tried to write about them, that I'd have been like, I actually don't know. But I felt kind of on safe ground with the stuff that I ended up writing.
Yeah. And Gina, for you, that mother-daughter relationship, that the mother, you know, her mother died just after she was born, so she's absent, but she has a very big presence in the story and in her life.
And really the story is about a father-daughter relationship too. And so Ruby's father is so insistent that he is the centre of her world, that there's no room, in his view, for her mother.
Yeah.
There's no need to talk about her mother, and there is also no place for what he feels is mourning. He doesn't really believe that she could mourn someone that she never knew. And yet, as a child, she is endlessly curious about other women, other girls and other mothers and their daughters. So despite his best efforts to exclude her mother from their life, it's impossible. And it's something that's very strong in Ruby, is that desire to find out more about her mother and of course about herself. Yeah.
Well, look, let's talk about, I feel like we can't ignore the fathers because they're strong presences in these books, and particularly in your book, Gina. Ruby's father, Mitch, he's kind of a delusional character, really. He has very strong ideas about parenting based on his own childhood experiences and wanting to do things in a certain way with Ruby and making assumptions that, you know, she will want a similar life to him. I'd like to ask you the same thing I asked you about the mother characters. Where did this very strong male figure come from?
Well, I was just really interested in that whole idea of parents who have children and seem to be able to continue the life that they had before they had children. I know there's not many of them. Most people find having children extremely disruptive, but I have known people who somehow are able to have their kids just bob along in their wake. And Mitch is really an extreme version of that. And while Ruby is bobbing along in his wake, he's happy, and there is no room for her to rebel. This is just the rule of their existence. So they travel Australia, they live out of a combi. He believes that he's providing her with an idyllic lifestyle, and she's expected to fall in behind him. And she does, definitely, to a certain point, and then the rift between them begins to grow as she gets more drawn towards women in her life, mother substitutes, and then interest in her real mother.
Yeah, I want to come back to that, the mother substitute, but I'd like to ask the both of you as well about the fathers in your books. Paul, Margaret seems very cross at Henry during the book, and we do later understand, when we come to the twist, part of the reason for that. But was Henry based on somebody that you knew? How did he come onto the page?
Not really. I mean, just probably, the book, some of the books set in Australia, a lot of it's set in Scotland, in Aberdeen, where I'm from. So he, to me, is just like the kind of guy, like my dad's friends, the kind of people who would have been parental age when I was a kid, probably, that I was thinking of for Henry. So, yeah, he unlike Margaret, there's no one person I would say that he falls into. You know.
Yeah. What about you, Rijn? Because you've got a father and then the grandfather who's a very, very strong presence in the book, who's an author, who's published an incredibly well-known book in Iceland. Where did those characters come from?
I think Elva's dad, I felt a bit sorry for him writing him, because his is a really quiet love for Elva, and it's so quiet that she doesn't see it. She doesn't know it's there. So which can definitely happen especially when you're young and bombastic in a way and want to discover yourself, and if you're loving them quietly in the background, they might miss it. So she goes off to Reykjavik because it's her mother's father, her grandfather, who's a famous children's author, and she leaves her dad behind, and she doesn't think that he necessarily cares, but he rings her every week, and he has a secret code to ring her so that she knows it's him and she picks up. And I think it's only towards the end that she thaws towards him a little bit and realised that he hasn't said, yeah, go to Iceland, go for it. He's let her go hoping that she would come back. And I felt more tenderness towards him at the end than I did at the start. But I loved the grandfather as well, because he was this gruff Icelandic man who wrote this one children's story that Elva's named after, but it's quite dark, a little bit grim, very kind of Brothers Grimm, and he kind of regrets it a little bit, but that's what connects Elva to him. So he's struggling to keep a hold of her, so is her dad, but she doesn't feel loved, I think, and that was, for him, I found myself, like I said, thawing towards the end of the book and thinking, oh, I want to take care of him now, and I didn't start out wanting to do that at all, so...
That's an interesting progression as an author, isn't it? Your relationship with your own characters changes. So let's pick up on this idea of the mothers or the other mother figures in the book. And Rijn, you have 6-year-old Grace, who Elva works with in this shop of curiosities. Do you think when we're without a mother that we seek a mother figure out in that way?
I'm honestly not so sure, because you can also, when you're young, deny that there is a lack. And I didn't want Grace to be completely a replacement mother, because Grace talks about being ambivalent about having wanted children. And she has a big punk past, and she's a little bit spiky, but it's clearly she takes Elva into her life and her shop, and it's very tender and protective and watchful over her. And I didn't start writing her as she's based on my Auntie Grace, who the book's dedicated to, which invested a whole different area of meaning to it. And she became almost my favourite character, Grace, because I got comfort writing her, and I miss her so much now.
Aww, she is a gorgeous character. I think we probably all like a Grace in our life.
Yeah, yeah.
Gina, Ruby is much younger than Elva, but she has this experience, a very strong experience of finding a kind of mother surrogate figure in her friend Fiona. And Fiona has, a mother and father and a stable home, whereas Ruby's used to this very itinerant lifestyle, and this is her first kind of experience that life could be different than it has been for her. Can you talk about the importance of this surrogate mother figure, Pauline?
Pauline is the mother of Fiona, who Ruby meets when she goes to school for the first time. And in many ways, Fiona and Ruby are very different. Fiona almost envies Ruby the life that she's had on the road, because she's the sort of kid who's dying to grow up and move away. But Pauline is Fiona's mother, and Pauline is quite careful with Ruby. She's never critical of Mitch, because she understands how protective Ruby is of her father, so she's quite careful. But Ruby is very drawn to Pauline and to this family, because she uses it. I think she sees that family and begins to understand what she's missed. She's never really consciously understood that before. So unconsciously, yes, she's always been interested in the lives of other people, and she's always been interested in seeing mothers with children, but it comes into her consciousness, I think, much more explicitly once she meets the Stanleys, and particularly Pauline, who does treat her like a mother would, although, as I say, she's quite careful about not overstepping the boundaries too, because she knows that if Mitch thought that she was being critical of him, he would probably intervene in some way to keep Ruby away. So she does walk a fine line with Ruby, helping to maintain that relationship with her dad at the same time that she's giving her, indirectly, she's giving her advice or trying to guide her in some way. And she becomes very important in the story as Mitch becomes increasingly intent on leaving, and Ruby is obviously increasingly intent on staying in this little town where they've been stranded.
Yeah, well, that's her first experience of really challenging her father and everything he stands for and their whole lifestyle, really.
Well, he sees it as a betrayal, and yet with most other families, a child wanting some independence would be seen as a healthy thing. With Mitch, because of the boundaries and the rules of their relationship, unless it's his way, then it's a betrayal. So it's very difficult for her.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Paul, Margaret's, your main character's daughter, Rachel, is a mother herself, and her partner, Jem. And Jem was actually one of my favourite characters. Even though Jem isn't on the page that much, I felt that you wrote that character with such warmth and affection.
Yeah, thanks.
And I'm interested to know where these two came from.
Oh, they're just, well, a little bit, Jem is a little bit based on, it's actually one of my wife's friends called Veronica. So a little bit based on her. More kind of, I was thinking of her looking like that, more, and maybe like a bit of her personality came from that. And Rachel, Rachel's maybe a bit me and a bit my wife, potentially, smooshed together, maybe. I think, they're really hard questions to answer. They're interesting, but I think basically, I think there are things that come into a character when it's happening, and you're maybe pulling it from a couple of different places. And sometimes, like I hadn't even thought that Jem was a bit based on my wife's friend Veronica until being asked that question now. But yeah, it's funny how.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, there's so much that happens subconsciously. So I think these questions are hard because as a writer, so often, you know, as you say, it's like they're an amalgamation potentially of all sorts of different people and things that you've observed over the years and things that have sort of gone into your subconscious, which you can't even necessarily identify where they've come from. So sorry for asking you the hard questions.
No, it's a good one. It's hard. It's not a bad question. It's just hard to answer.
Okay, I'm going to throw a quote at you from literary heavyweight Michael J. Fox, who said, "Family is not an important thing, it's everything. And family and the idea of home and whatever form that takes are central to all three of your books. So I'm wondering whether that was something you deliberately set out to explore or whether that just came about through the characters. Rijn, you've talked about how, you know, Elva has left Australia for Iceland and is looking for family, but do you think she's also searching for what home means?
I think she's probably looking for home more than her... I didn't know this until now. Probably looking for home more than her family, and through... Again, I can't really talk about the twist in my book, but she's there to look for her mum, but mostly she needs to find where she belongs, and she's half Icelandic, half Australian, and they are literally poles apart. And it's, I think a lot of my writing is a search for home, a central place, but also I'm deeply engaged with the space that I'm in. I was, in my late teens and early 20s, I was agoraphobic for a couple of years. I found it very hard to leave my house. And so I became acutely attuned to where, even if it's just like a hotel room today, like being aware of where I feel safe and where I feel okay. Had a friend say once, Rijn, you'd get attached to a bus stop if you stood there long enough. And she wasn't wrong. I do have a favourite bus stop. So I think that home is safety, and for some people, that's family. But for me and for Elva, I think it's somewhere where you can feel a sense of serenity and not a sense of ache. And I'm not even sure if she's found that yet. I hope she has. But she went there for what she thought was family, but I think that it was to find out where she belongs.
I love the way you talk about her as if she's still out there living her life, finding herself. And don't you think that's something you feel that your characters are still living beyond once the book's out?
I do, and her apartment was based on an Airbnb I stayed in Reykjavik. You go up the stairs and it's an attic apartment. And when I finished, and as writers know, there's so much redrafting. I didn't know. I actually posted, I finished my novel. I'm so embarrassed about that now. Like 17 drafts and 4 years later. But when it was actually signed off on, I thought, I will not climb those stairs again. And I will not sit. She collects taxidermy, and I had my own taxidermy all around my writing studio. I'm like, do I pack this away? Like, I genuinely miss her space. I miss her friends. I had the Aurora forecast on my phone. I checked the app every day before I wrote. Like, do I delete that? So it came out of such passions, and I do love her, and I hope she's okay. Like, I think she is, but hopefully I might get a bit better at separating them all. I'm working on my second novel. But you can't write a book about someone you don't love, I think, or wish for the best for. So, yeah, I think she's still in Reykjavik. I think she's okay. Yeah.
I'm pleased to hear it. Gina, your book explores that idea of family and home, but also the idea that family is not necessarily those who are related to you by blood, but sometimes they're the people that you choose. And Ruby chooses a family to also be a part of her life. Can you talk about that?
Well, yeah, I think, and related to your question, I think that your question to Rijn, but I think that with Ruby, family is all about finding her identity. And her life with Mitch has given her a strong sense of independence, and she's developed all sorts of traits that he values. But being with the Stanleys as a family, she gets an opportunity to compare herself to another person her age. So Fiona is almost like a sister, although, I was going to say, although they don't fight, there's tension between them, but, you know, and yeah, the family is, that family is her way, I think, of trying on different identities, finding out more about herself, and also understanding that families are about telling stories and having a shared history. And with her and Mitch, their shared history is literally in that combi. They never stay anywhere for any length of time. They have no friends, they have no relatives to speak of. So it's a kind of, they live in this very intense bubble. And that opens up when she's with the Stanleys, and she's allowed to do things, and she's given permission to be herself in ways that she's not when she's living solely with Mitch. So it is an opening up of her life, and also subsequently, of course, her life has been completely overshadowed, her early life growing up with Mitch. She has to come to terms with him in some way in order to move on into her adult life too. Yeah.
Paul, your book's about moving on too. Margaret is, you know, she's dead, but she's actually assessing her whole life essentially. And it's a very intimate portrait of one family. So what was it that drew you to write about this particular family?
Well, I think families are everything, really. I think,
agree with Michael J. Fox then?
Yeah, I do, on that and other things too. I just watched Back to the Future with my youngest son the other night, so Michael J. Fox is in my mind. I think whether it's a found family or an adopted family or your biological family, whoever fulfills that role of family when you're a child, there's such large and looming archetypes throughout your whole life, just inevitably. So even if you have, I'm thinking of Mitch in your book, but in all of our lives, somebody who doesn't necessarily want to play the role of role model, but they're in a parental or a caring role for a child, you're inevitably a role model. So if you don't turn up as the parent, you're a role model. If you sit drinking beer and just ignoring your kids, you're a role model. If you're the modern helicopter parent who's there all the time, you're a role model. And it's the archetypes are just so big. I mean, if we talk about biological mums, I mean, we lived inside our biological mums. There's nobody else we're going to live inside during our lives, so that's a huge role. These people you look up to as a small child are just gigantic, and I think families that you all toss your coins into this kind of hat that's a shared nostalgia, and even if it's not your particular favorite memories, you build these memories together as a family of disparate people that become those stories that are almost mythological. I mean, they're more important than any myth you're going to hear elsewhere because they're the things you grow up with. And whether you spend your life running away from that family or saying, I'll never be like my family, or I can't stand my sister or my brother or whatever, they're still huge archetypes. They're either a magnet pulling you in or pushing you apart. They're very rarely a neutral force. And I think, when it comes to siblings, just that thing of you're sitting in the back of the same car together for years, that ends. When you're a kid, you don't know it's going to end. But these people just around you, a little pod, a little reality, just has such a kind of profound effect, and all the drama you would ever need, I think, as any kind of writer is there in the most seemingly basic, everyday family.
Yeah, totally. Oh, there's another couple of questions I so want to ask you, but we need to throw to questions to the audience. So does anybody have a question for our panellists? We've got a microphone here. If you raise your hand. If you don't, I will ask away. Oh, yes, there's a hand down here.
Thank you, great panel. Writing is so lonely and isolating sometimes. So when you're talking about these extraordinary relationships you have with the characters on the page, I'm interested in how you navigate the ironic fact that it often takes you away from your caring duties and the people that you care about in your life. How do you navigate writing in your lives and other responsibilities?
Thank you, Kate Milton-Hall, who I can't actually see, but I can know your voice. So thank you for that question. Who wants to answer?
I'm lucky that my husband's a novelist. So I can just say, look, I'm not going to talk tonight. I'm just going to put my headphones in. I've got my playlist. He's like, oh, thank God. And and we'll go down the pub with our computers and our notebooks and we'll take it out once an hour to go, do you need another beer? Well, let's be honest, we're writers once every half an hour. Do you need another beer? And so that has been absolutely liberating. I only met him in my 40s, so before I've always had partners threatened by, what are you writing? Are you writing again? Like, it's my job. Yeah. So I feel very blessed that I have a partner and family and friends who I'm not coming tonight, I've got to write, or I'm going away by myself, you're not invited. And I've had people say, why didn't you go to Iceland with him? Like, I didn't ask him. Like, I had stuff to do. So I'm very lucky, but it has been a very hard one, trust me.
Yeah, I think you need to be quite ruthless and selfish, actually. Having said that, I also have a wonderful partner and a family who, when my daughter was younger, provided fantastic childcare, and have really, the people around me have always supported me being a writer, but I do feel that at times it feels quite ruthless because you are absenting yourself. You are going on holiday and I don't think to invite my partner.
No, mine's actively not invited.
And being alone in a room is just the greatest pleasure.
Yes.
So it can be hard for people to understand that, and I think hard for them perhaps, wonderful that they don't feel rejected and hurt by it. But yeah, I think you have to be kind of ruthless.
My kids have grown up with it really, but most of my writing really gets done between 5 and 7 in the morning, which is before they wake up.
Gasp. God.
Well, when I was saying I don't cry much, that's one time when I feel like crying when the alarm goes off. It's especially bad when it's not a good writing session and you're like, why'd I
get up?
And also, they both love playing computer games, so it'll be like, you can't play it all the time, but maybe for the next 6 hours while I write. It's the way I try and get around it. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions in the audience? Over here.
Hello, Jess. You read or hear about writers who, get up at 9 a.m. in the morning and do their so many hours work. How do the individual authors deal with their own ebb and flow of creativity? Like you need, a week of writing before something happens, or do you, how do each of you have what's your moment or best moment of writing time?
My day job is a journalist, so I'm kind of used to writing when I don't feel like it. I have to do it all the time. And what I usually just try and think is, if it feels like there's some kind of inspiration, that's fantastic, but if not, at least I'll get something down. And it could be rubbish, it could be just discarded, or maybe there's a few lines in it that's good, or maybe there's a paragraph that's good, or a page, or whatever. So I just try and whenever I can grab the time, just write. And ideally, something will happen and it'll feel like it's inspired, but quite often it's not that. But as long as you have something down, then when the inspiration comes or you're feeling in that mood, you can go back to that bit and make it better, is my kind of thinking.
Are you writing 5 till 7 every day or 5 days?
No, I haven't written at that time for actually about 6 months. I work from home, so I steal, like my lunch breaks and stuff, I try and steal an hour there, or as soon as I finish work, if my kids are otherwise occupied, for half an hour or an hour. So I haven't quite got back into that discipline yet, but I was doing that for a very long time, so I felt I needed a break.
I teach 5 days a week, but I set a lot of tests, so I can write while they're doing tests. I teach a test class, so it's part of the job, but I find that writing I absolutely love and passionate about the research stage, so I think even if you're, if I had the Reykjavik map open or I was translating some lyrics, it still counts, so writing to me is not just how many lines on a page, but what I've thought of or drawn or clipped out, how that advances the story, and then I feel that when I've had enough of that done, the words come. So it's not so much judged by me as how many words on the page, but just how much more confident do I feel about the story or more passionate, and that is a huge part of the writing process, and I can do that on the tram with my headphones in. So I feel that every day I try and do something that inches the next story along, whether it's actually 2 hours of writing time, which I don't get that often anymore. I'm kind of always doing it in my head or just little scribbles of notes.
And I've been fortunate to have a room that I've rented for years away from home, and I've always found that's been really helpful. Until very recently, well, probably until about 5 years ago, there was no internet. And I mean, if I want to be really disciplined, I can leave my phone in the letterbox, which is on the ground floor, and then there's 3 flights of stairs up to my office. But I never know, so I do go there and work regularly, like a job, but I never feel, I can never remember when I wrote the things I'm happiest with, because most of the time when I'm writing, the way I feel about the writing doesn't have a lot to do with how good or bad it is. You know, I can feel quite negative about it some days, and then I'll look back on what I've written the day before, think actually that was really good. So I try not to let that judgment get in the way. I just try and show up, get the words on the page, and I think probably for me, I know it's been a really good session if I realise suddenly that 4 hours have passed and I've been totally absorbed. If I'm totally absorbed, I feel then that I've written something that hopefully will have that effect on the reader. Yeah.
Well, I think we can maybe sneak in one more question. Are there any others out there? No? You will maybe make us keep to time then. Because I know if I ask a question, it's going to take longer. So, all right, well, I would like you to join me in thanking our three fabulous panellists, Gina, Paul and Rijn.